Egypt's slave soldiers, from captives to guardians of Pharaoh. The history of ancient Egypt is often remembered for its towering pyramids, golden tombs, and the immortal legacy of its pharaohs. But behind this glittering facade lay countless stories of power, survival, and human struggle. Among the most fascinating and often overlooked elements of this story is the role of slave soldiers, men taken from foreign lands who, through force, circumstance or fate, found themselves wielding weapons in service to the very kings who had enslaved them. Unlike simple labourers in quarries or farmers bound to estates, these soldiers became instruments of the state, protectors of temples, defenders of Egypt's borders, and in some cases, even the trusted bodyguards of the pharaoh himself. Their existence highlights not only Egypt's reliance on conquest and foreign labour, but also the complicated interplay of loyalty, coercion and opportunity within one of the world's oldest civilizations. The Nile Valley was surrounded by peoples who often came into contact and sometimes conflict with Egypt. Nubians from the south, Libyans from the west, and Asiatic groups from the east all found themselves drawn into Egypt's orbit, sometimes as traders or allies, but often as captives taken in war. Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions proudly depicted victorious armies leading chained prisoners into the presence of the pharaoh, proof of both divine favour and military might. Many of these captives were destined for lives of agricultural toil or servitude within households. Yet a number of them, especially strong young men, were trained for military purposes. You know, for the Egyptian state, these captives offered a ready pool of manpower. But for the captives themselves, military service could mean hardship, sure, but also the possibility of a status far higher than that of ordinary slaves. The reliance on foreign soldiers, well, it wasn't unique to Egypt, but it definitely carried particular significance there. The pharaohs, often quite cautious about entrusting their personal security to rival Egyptian nobles or ambitious generals, found it safer to place their trust in outsiders who had no local loyalties. A Nubian or Libyan captive had no clan in Egypt to support him, no faction to betray him to. Really, his survival depended on the very ruler he served. So, as a result, many of these men became part of elite royal guards, serving in close proximity to the most powerful figure in Egypt. Some were stationed in palace garrisons, others escorted rulers on campaigns, and some even stood watch at sacred ceremonies where the pharaoh, well, he embodied the divine order of the cosmos. The paradox of their existence is striking. These men were by origin slaves, bound to serve against their will, torn from their homes and families. Yet within Egypt, their role gave them weapons, training and access to the royal household, privileges denied to countless Egyptian peasants who were technically free. In certain cases, slave soldiers could even rise in rank, commanding units of fellow foreigners, or being granted small estates in return for loyal service. Egyptian records, though rarely focused on the lives of common soldiers, hint at the respect and fear such men could command. Their bodies were their currency, their discipline their shield, and their loyalty their path to survival. Over time, the presence of foreign soldiers left a cultural imprint on Egypt. Nubian archers, famed for their deadly accuracy, were especially prized and frequently depicted in Egyptian art. Libyans contributed their own martial traditions, while Asiatic groups brought different skills in chariot warfare and infantry tactics. By incorporating these diverse fighters, Egypt not only strengthened its armies, but also absorbed fragments of foreign culture into its own military practices. The slave soldiers were, in a sense, living symbols of Egypt's domination of its neighbours, but they were also reminders of the interconnectedness of the ancient world, where conquest and captivity could reshape entire societies. The role of slave soldiers as bodyguards to the pharaoh reveals even more about the delicate balance of trust and fear within Egyptian politics. The pharaoh, seen as a god on earth, was nonetheless a man vulnerable to betrayal, assassination or rebellion. Native-born elites, despite their status, could not always be trusted for power-bred ambition. A bodyguard of foreign-born slaves, however, had no local ties and no claim to the throne. Their existence depended entirely on the will of the ruler. By making these captives his protectors, the pharaoh turned enemies into shields, transforming the conquered into defenders of his sacred body. It was a profound reversal of fortune, and one that reveals the pragmatic genius of Egyptian statecraft. The lives of these soldiers were not easy. They endured rigorous training, harsh discipline, and, the constant reminder that their freedom was limited. Yet their service sometimes opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Certain foreign soldiers gained honours, marriage alliances, or land as rewards for loyalty. In rare cases, they and their descendants assimilated into Egyptian society, their foreign origins gradually forgotten. In this way, the institution of slave soldiery blurred the rigid lines between slave and free, outsider and insider. And it demonstrated that even within the strict hierarchies of ancient Egypt, the potential for mobility existed, though it came at a great personal cost. The use of slave soldiers also speaks to the broader nature of slavery in Egypt, which differed in some respects from the brutal plantation systems of later eras. Slaves in Egypt occupied many roles: labourers, artisans, concubines, administrators and soldiers, each with its own level of hardship or privilege. Military service was one of the most paradoxical, demanding obedience yet offering power, stripping men of their freedom yet giving them weapons with which to enforce the freedom of others. This complexity reflects the layered and adaptive nature of Egyptian society, which thrived not only through its monuments and gods, but also through the lives of those who served, willingly or otherwise, within its vast machinery. As centuries passed, the tradition of foreign-born soldiers continued, eventually evolving into formal mercenary corps rather than simple slave troops. By the late period, Greeks, Nubians and other groups served as professional soldiers in Egypt's armies, a development that owed much to the earlier practice of employing enslaved captives. The line between slave and mercenary blurred, but the legacy remained. Egypt had long depended on the strength of outsiders to guard its borders and protect its kings. Today, when we admire the colossal statues of pharaohs or gaze upon the silent temples along the Nile, it is easy to forget the men who stood in the shadows of those kings, spears in hand, their lives caught between bondage and duty. The slave soldiers of Egypt were both victims and actors in history, forced into service yet shaping the very empire that enslaved them. They remind us that the story of Egypt is not only one of golden crowns and sacred rituals, but also of the countless unnamed individuals whose strength and sacrifice upheld the throne. In the end, the tale of Egypt's slave soldiers is one of irony and resilience. Captured in war, stripped of freedom and thrust into a foreign land, they became guardians of the mightiest ruler of their age. They embodied both conquest and survival, oppression and power, loyalty and fear. Their presence reveals the hidden layers of Egyptian history, where even slaves could become protectors of gods, and where the boundaries of power and servitude were constantly tested. In their shadows lies a reminder of the complexities of human history, where freedom and bondage are not always simple opposites, but parts of the same enduring struggle for survival and meaning in the ancient world.